Safely raise and support your vehicle on the frame so your suspension can hang. Now that we've safely raised the vehicle, let's remove this by using a small pry bar right in this little slot. Now you can see your 22mm lug nuts. Remove those. Now that the wheel's off, we have a clear view of where our upper ball joint nut is, right here above the axle. Go ahead and get that cotter pin out of there. It might not want to necessarily come out. You might have to cut it and then punch it through. Try to grab onto it. Ooh. So I sprayed that down again. Now I'm going to use my wrench. I'm going to try to get this off of here. Right off of there. Now we're going to get the ABS wire off of the upper control arm. There's a bolt that comes through from the bottom to the top. Hold the bottom, take off the top nut. Let's get this off of here. Now we're going to carefully push back the caliper piston. If you look right here, that's the piston. We want that to go all the way back as far as it can go. Some people would choose to open up their bleeder screw. If yours is in poor condition like ours is, it's probably going to break off, in which case, just push it back nice and slow. Now we have a steel piston here, it's not ceramic, so it's okay to go ahead and try to pry up against it. You can test it with a magnet. If the magnet holds, you know it's steel. Let's use a 3/8 Allen socket and remove these slider pins. Let's grab the caliper off of here. We'll set that aside. Let's go ahead and get this rotor off of here. Now that we have the caliper hanging, not from the flex hose, we have it hanging from a nice cord here. That way there it's not putting any pressure on that flex hose. We're going to go ahead and take the upper ball joint nut. We're going to put it on just a couple threads here. The reason for starting this on a couple threads is because the next thing we're going to do is take a pickle fork and we're going to try to separate these two. Once it separates, we want to make sure that the knuckle doesn't come flying down and potentially rip the axle apart. Take your pickle fork and your little hammer, separate the two. Now that we've got this separated, let's go ahead and take the nut off. Just be careful as you take it off because this is going to swing down and you don't want to separate this area of the axle. There we are. Carefully bring this down. The next thing we're going to do, you can either remove this by removing all these push clips or just flip it up. Once you've done that, you can see the nut that we're going to remove, and on the other side is where the bolt's going to come through. I'm going to hold that bolt with a 21mm. Now we're going to remove this nut using a 21mm as well. You can see it starting to come out, and you can also see this right here. You want to make sure that you don't lose those, okay? If you drop one, just go ahead and grab it. They should just slide up the bolt, just like that. We're going to use a punch. We'll push this out the rest of the way, and then we're going to do the same to the other side. We just want to remember that this was facing down. Let's do the same to this one. As you can tell, you can roll this up so you have a better view. That's always nice. There it is, friends. So now we're going to take our two mounting bolts here. I like to use a little bit of grease. You could also use some copper never sees. You do you, boo-boo. Go right along this shanked area. That's going to help make sure these come out nice and easy down the line. Now it's time to put in the upper control arm. It's important to make sure that your control arm matches up with the one you took out, because if you have the one for the other side of the vehicle, it's going to cause a big issue. Another good way to tell, if you're not sure because the curves are about the same, you could just look at where the bolt hole is missing. If you have the one for the other side, the bolt hole is going to be missing over here. This looks great. Let's install. There we are. Just going to leave this sitting for a second. Grab my bolt. I remember it came through from the inside, through, and that this was facing down. It's nice and lubricated, so that's good. Getting all over my hands. That one's through. Let's do the same to the other side, and then we'll continue on. Let's get these on there with our nut. If you want to use a little thread locker, we'll call it your prerogative, but these nuts should be locking nuts. Now, before we tighten them down, it's important to make sure that you don't have your control arm hanging down like this. Of course, it's going to put strain on the bushings. Once you go ahead and put this on the ground, it's going to start stretching them. So you want to make sure you have it approximately ground level. If you had the vehicle on the ground, this would be about where the vehicle is sitting. So that looks good. I'm going to find a way to hold this like this, and then we'll go ahead and continue. Now that I shimmed this with a nice piece of wood, I have it so this is approximately level with the ground. That's going to be great. We're going to go ahead and hold on to the bolt side and tighten up the nut side. I'm just going to snug it, and then we're going to torque it to manufacturer's specifications. Let's go ahead and torque these upper bolts to 140 foot-pounds. Torqued. Next, we're going to take a nice big pry bar. We're going to come right across the top of the control arm, underneath the frame. We're going to grab our nut, have that ready. Now let's tighten this up. The torque spec for it should be 74 foot-pounds. Something to keep in mind is it might be a little difficult to torque where you have the axle in the way. So make it nice and tight. Once you're sure you've got it as tight as possible, with the wrench of course, I would try to make sure that you line up the castle nut slot with the hole that goes through the ball joint, and then go ahead and put in your cotter pin. Once you have the cotter pin through, make sure that you peen it over. That way there it'll stay locked. Beautiful. Let's take our grease fitting, start it in here. Make sure you snug it up. Perfect. Let's move along to this right here. You want to make sure that you have your ABS cable secured. You don't want it to be rubbing against the rotor if it can move around. So now we're going to take a bolt and the nut that came with the kit, put it right through. Start the nut on the bottom there. The nut is a 12 millimeter and the top is a 13. We're going to grab these little clips. They should slide right over the control arm, and then they're going to hold your ABS wire nice and secure. I'm going to slide that one up quite a bit. Put that wire in, do the same thing to the other one. Perfect. That's going to protect this from getting damaged. Let's grease up this ball joint. Pay special attention to the boot under there. Make sure that it expands, but it doesn't necessarily keep expanding to the point that it blows open and squirts grease all over the place. Awesome. Let's get that new rotor on there. Make sure you take one of your lug nuts and tighten this down. That way there the rotor can't move around. Get the caliper on. We've got our two bolts. If you need to clean up the threads, now's the time to do it, but these look fine. Now that they're both started in, we're going to snug them up and then we'll torque them to manufacturer's specifications. Torque your slider bolts to 38 foot-pounds. Torqued. Let's get this off of here. We'll get our wheels back on. We're going to put on all the lug nuts. We're going to snug them up in a crisscross manner. Torque these to 120 foot-pounds. It's torqued. We'll get our cover on here. Awesome.